Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are close to the bottom of page 1312. 1312. Aleph Shiur Beis. And the discussion is in a very orderly, progressive way. The Rabbi Rashab is dissecting the anatomy of Helam, of concealment through the process of creation, or what we called before Cheshech. We talked about the two aspects, dimensions of darkness. One is its own entity, a Biy'a b'fnei atzma, and its role as a concealer and a limiter and a materializer of Oir, which was explained. The dugma is with the example of the faculties in the human body. And then the dugma, the example of that in the Oiris and Kelim of Atzilus. That was pages 1311, 1312. The new paragraph on 1312, he said that's all the Esespheres of Atzilus. So there, on one hand, there's concealment, but it's still a divine world. Like we said, Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'gamu echad, the Oiris and Kelim, the energies and containers of Atzilus are all divine. Yet in the divine itself, there's levels of more revelation, less revelation. Like we discussed, what Oiris and Kelim do, how the Kelim regulate the flow and so on. And bear in mind, this is all the process of creation, not through Aveda. This is how the Oir goes downward. However, as the divine reflection, the divine light descends further down into Biy'a, it gets concealed, very concealed in the worlds of Biy'a. And the beginning of that concealment is through the parsa, the veil, the curtain, the partition between Atzilus and Biy'a, which causes, it shifts and alters the personality of the energy. Shemahusa ered Atzilus ein mer klal b'Biy'a. It doesn't radiate at all in Biy'a, the mahus, the personality of the Oir in Atzilus, and even the Eir HaNeshama of Biy'a, of Biy'a rather, which comes from the outer containers of Malchus of Atzilus, is also not at all the way it is in Atzilus. And like the Tikkun Ezeiah says, that in Biy'a, lav iyu v'chayu v'gamu echad. The energies and containers are not one in a complete seamless union with who? With iyu, with God, as it is in Atzilus. That, he says, it refers to the Eir HaNeshama. And that's where we stopped. So now he's going to continue this discussion of how the Oir, the divine energy, gets even further concealed in Biy'a, and explain it again. It's pretty much summarized here, but he's relying a lot on earlier reference, making references and relying on earlier Maimonim and earlier parts of the Hemshech where this was discussed. So I'm going to continue reading from the 6 lines. From the bottom of the page, 1312. Pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow the text. So it's continuing to flow from what we just learned. That in Biy'a, even the higher levels of Biy'a, which is the Eir HaNeshama, not Ruach and Nefesh, even that Eir HaNeshama, which does have a relationship and something from the Kelim, from the containers of Malchus of Atzilus, because like I said, Biy'a is not a complete new reality. Atzilus does ultimately empower and energize Biy'a, but it's with a certain paradigm shift has happened, yet another one from these two worlds, and that's all leading up to explaining ultimately how the divine gets more and more concealed, and we'll soon learn all the way how it's concealed in this physical world. So a little more now on Biy'a. So he says, "Ukamoy shakelim de Biy'a tevsim mesaer." And the way, this is literally a continuing from what we just read. I just stopped yesterday simply for time reasons, but it's not a new thing. He's continuing the sentence. He says, and the way the Kelim of Biy'a, the containers of Biy'a are tefus, grasp and appreciate and understand and contain and relate to the Oir, hadi'ena mahusa er klal. It's not the very personality of the Oir, ki imit siyuse. Only its existence. So again, he brings Mahusa Mitzias. You may recall that a page back, he said exactly the same language in the difference between how a neshama without a body and without the faculties manifesting within the limbs and body, they relate, he said, to the Mohus Eir Eliki, Hasagas HaNeshama ben Mohus Eir Eliki. And Bislapshas HaKeches Be'evri Aguf, I'm reading from top of page 1311, Boim Bakshama Dikech HaSeichel, and there he says, the Kol Saskol B'chinas HaMetzias Lavad. And that was an example for Eris and Kalim of Atzilus. So you can immediately ask the question, one second, he's using this language now in Biy'a. Even in Atzilus, we said, when the Eir comes into the Keli, it's the Metzias, not the Mohus. Apparently. So obviously the answer is it's all relative, because we're not talking about two levels here. We're talking about infinite amount of levels. And everything, think of a teacher and students. So in general, you talk about Mohus and Metzias, that someone understands the very personality of the idea, and the other only understands its existence. Like we spoke about, Mahus is Mahu. So for example, you could see two people could talk about, let's say, subatomic energy. One can say, I know it exists, but I know nothing about it. And the other can dissect and understand a little more about its personality. So generally speaking, Mahus means you have a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation of the personality. Or you could say about a person. You meet a stranger. You meet someone sitting at your table, he's a guest. First time you meet him, you know his mitzias. You know he exists. But what do you know about his personality? You may sense there's something there, but you don't know, like we talked about the artist. You know that art dictates that there's the mitzias of an artist. That there must be an artist somewhere. The art didn't create itself. Someone had to create it. Someone had to draw it. Then when you meet the artist and you know the artist, you got getting to know his personality. So there's infinite amount of levels of how much you know. Like you may have a friend that you know well, someone who's their brother or sister may know them even better than you. And the same thing with godliness. Even though in Atzilus there's also Metzias and Mahus, like we just discussed, like we said on page 1311, but in Biy'a, it goes down even further down, where even the Eir HaNeshama, since it's not one with Ihu, he says, so the way the Kalim Tefis, the Eir of Atzilus, it's like in Atzilus itself, there's also Mahus and Metzias. It only takes the Metzias of the Eir, not the Mahus of the Eir. Similar to the way it is on a higher level that the Kalim of Atzilus get the Metzias of the Eir, of what's higher than Atzilus, and higher levels appreciate the Mahus. The Eir on its own can appreciate, like you said, the Eir that's higher than Islapshus B'Kelim relates more to the Mahus, to the personality. Okay. U'kamoishin is boyer sham. So he's referring to most likely the parentheses, Vahi B'Yem Hashmini, a few lines before, where he said, U'kamoishin is boyer li'il, that even the Eir HaNeshama of Biy'a does not, that comes from the outer containers of Malchus of Atzilus. It's not at all the way it's not Atzilus. Like he said, it's not Iyu v'chayui v'gamui echad. And the way he grasps it, it's only the Metzias, not the Mohus. Commission is Bar Sham, referring back to those Maimorim. So this is really, he's summing up that which we learned earlier in volume 2 about this topic. So if you really want more elaboration, you have to really go back there. Okay. Commission is Bar Sham. Or Memela, and since the Kalim now in Biy'a only grasp the Metzias, not the Mohus, or Memela harei malimim umastirim esair. So that means that they are naturally concealing and covering on the Eir, because they only get a certain amount of it, only its existence, not its personality. In a way, you could say it's like the light of the sun. We benefit from the light of the sun, but we don't know necessarily a lot about the sun unless we study the sun. So if a regular person wakes up in the morning and the sun is shining, and we're warmed by it, and we're illuminated, and it brings daylight and other benefits, that's the mitzias of the Eir. The Mahus of the Eir would require far more analysis and study and so on, examination. Okay. The male it covers and conceals on the Eir. To the point that the level of the garments of Biy'a Okay, so now we're entering for the first time. Till now, we've talked about concealment, a higher level of godliness, a lower revelation, a more concealed state, a more revealed state. Like he spoke before, the kalim become more substance, the air becomes less apparent and less ethereal. Now he's introducing teva ra for the first time, good and evil. Till now we never heard the word ra because it says lo yigur chara. In Atzilus there is no ra, God forbid. It's purely elikus. Where is there the possibility of something that is negative? And I like to use the word negative rather than ra, because evil has, I think, is a very loaded word. You know, evil, you right away say is Hitler is evil. There are people who are just evil human beings or evil actions. So even though correct to say teva ra does mean good and evil, but I think for more accuracy purposes, I'm going to use more positive and negative. What means negative? Meaning something that is not godly. And the Alter Rebbe says it quite clearly. When you learn chapter 6 in Tanya, he doesn't use the word, he uses the word reyes ra, but he doesn't use the word reyes halev. He doesn't use the word ra as in he says whatever is not godly, whatever is not bottled to God is considered sitrachen. So it's a very practical but also very illuminating translation. Because what does it mean, evil? What does evil mean? So most of us, evil means a person who hurts other human beings, a cruel person, a sadistic person. You know, the Nazis epitomized evil. They went and they mercilessly killed innocent men, women, and children. You know, so that's like the classic evil act, the evil behavior, evil person. But if you really want to understand what does that mean exactly, this person was also created by God. So what happened? So obviously free will. So you could choose to do things that are horrendous, atrocious behavior. The person has that ability. But what's the root of it? Even though it's not here in the Biy'a to talk about exactly how evil evolved, I do want to say a few words about it because at the end of the day, it's coming from as a result of concealment. If the divine was never been concealed, Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, you definitely, not only wouldn't you have evil, you b'chlal wouldn't have any consciousness that can go against God. Or not, or I would say even more than that, that is not godly. Once it's not, something is completely godly, then it's completely aligned with the goodness of godliness. So the truth is, anything that wavers, even on a subtle level, I think a good example would be health. You don't need for a person, God forbid, to have a full-blown disease or heart attack or some other prominent problem to say there's a problem. Obviously, that's a serious problem. But usually things start with on a small scale. There's a symptom, there's an infection. Obviously, God has his mysterious ways. I'm not saying it has to be that way, but very often something starts small that initially would not even be life-threatening. If it was nipped in the bud or realized, many diseases can be eliminated. But the problem is we may not know or may be ignored. So it always begins with one small shift from a healthy, seamless flow. And the symptom may be very mild. It may not even be felt. But when you start studying the process, you see, so it was ignored, it got worse, it spread to the point now it's much harder to deal with. And it could end up being life-threatening, God forbid. The same thing is Lamaila. If there was no tzimtzum, you'd have one divine consciousness, omnipresent. Obviously, there'd be no purpose in it because that's what God wanted. But conceptually speaking, that state is a pure state. On a microcosmic level, that's the state of Adam and Chava before the tree, they ate from the tree of knowledge. They were seamless creatures created by God. And therefore, that's why they were naked and not ashamed. Like a newborn child, what is there to be ashamed of? Sexuality is part of God's creation. There's nothing wrong with it. On the contrary, it's part of God's plan. It's a way that people create life. That's the way God created. He gave us eyes and ears. He also gave us sexuality. Just to give that example as the Torah talks about. What happened? Adam and Chava were given choice. And they chose, unfortunately, to disconnect to not follow orders. So now that aligned state where they were in a healthy way aligned exactly with what their creator created them, think of it like a machine, a computer or another appliance that's being used exactly as the engineer that created it wants it to be used, will hum along smoothly. But let's say you neglect the machine, you let water spill into it, or you put it into a very hot room, or you don't follow the orders that the engineer said, the operator's manual said how you should use this machine. So right away, you've done the first mistake, because, like I said, with the health, something has wandered off the reservation. So it's not aligned perfectly. You can correct it by all means, but if it's not corrected, things will get worse. It will escalate. It's exactly what he says in Basa Legani, when he brings from the Medrash Shir Hashirim Rabba, Basa Legani Achesi Kala, that the beginning was Legani Legnuni Ksiv, Legani Leksiv El Legnuni. What? That this is God's bridal chamber. Ikashchina B'Tachtenim, so it was all aligned. They ate from the tree of knowledge, created the first dissonance, if you wish. Now it didn't stop there. The next generation, there was more sin. What is a sin really? Aveda comes from the word havarim reshus l'reshus. It's a displacement. Instead of it being aligned, it's a misalignment. What's mitzvah come from? The word connection. And Aveda is a disconnection. Make one disconnection between the wires, you're beginning to have problems. Obviously, you can correct it and you can compensate for it. But let's say the disconnection continues further and further. You know, Chassidus brings from Sfarim that the Tayyag mitzvahs are sometimes compared to Tayyag lifelines. Like think of 613 oxygen lines that are going into your soul from God. Every mitzvah, positive mitzvah, carries that oxygen. Every Aveda makes sure there's no blockage. However, if a person doesn't do a mitzvah, one of those lifelines gets blocked. If they do an Aveda, the same. So Friedrich Rebbe has an interesting mashal one place about deep sea diving. So there's diving with a scuba diving with oxygen on your back. But remember, there's also, we all know the images of divers that go down into underwater and they have a pipeline that connects them to the surface. You know, and that type of diving, that pipeline is the very essence of who you are. Friedrich Rebbe says, imagine, God forbid, if that pipeline gets severed or blocked. So a diver knows every second, is completely cognizant and therefore vigilant to make sure that that line stays intact. His very life is dependent on it. But in Gashmis Elam, the Friedrich Rebbe says, we don't feel always those lines. So the point being is that mitzvahs and Avedas are not just good deeds and bad deeds. They're not just commandments and prohibitions. They're actually lifelines. This is what the operator's manual is saying. This is how you connect to the spiritual oxygen of the divine energy that gives you that when you cleave and you connect, the energy flows within you, just like soul in a body. And God forbid, disconnect will begin to create a problem. So the problem doesn't begin when it's already a full-blown illness. It begins with one little concealment. So once they're there, that can begin the process. Now, another way of saying concealment, you could say a break, a severing, a disconnect, And that's why Adam and Chava, Hashem says to Adam, Ayeko, where are you? Well, Hashem didn't know where he was. The famous question the minister asked the Alter Rebbe, Hashem doesn't know where Adam is hiding. But Ayeko is a deeper statement. I don't recognize you. The Tselem Elokim, you were completely aligned with me. You were my child, completely aligned the way I created you, La'avda L'shamar, to serve and protect. You've betrayed yourself and betrayed me. So I don't recognize you. It's like a person sitting with someone. You see they're there, but they ask, where are you? Are you with me? Your presence I don't feel. Sometimes a person can be sitting near you, but they're not with you. So essentially, Ayeko is the first description of a disconnect. Where are you? I don't recognize you. Are you living up to your purpose? Your being, who you are is not aligned with what you're doing is not aligned with who you are, with who you should be, with your mission in life. So I'm only explaining it because I want to explain how his Salmos ultimately leads to what we're going to be talking now about Teva and Ra. So it's not full-blown evil at this point. It's just that something is no longer in Atzilus, it's completely aligned. It's a structure. Divine is definitely concealed. Eris and Kalim and Atzilus is not like the that's higher than the Kali. And definitely not the Etzema going all the way up to the highest levels of Bligvul. But the Bligvul has been concealed, and even the Gvul has been concealed, as we learned in the previous paragraph. But nowhere does it say that we've moved into an area that is antithetical to God. It's still a world of godliness, except godliness in a contained state, in a confined state. The structure of Esesphiris. In Biy'a, we've moved now into a concept of self. I'm starting to feel myself. Adam and Chava did not feel a self before they ate from the tree of knowledge. Or maybe they did, that's why they ate from it. But I mean, they'd say initially they were aligned. As soon as there's self-consciousness, so now your consciousness is separate from God's consciousness. That does not mean a sin, but it's the beginning of everything that can happen. I remember when I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life, the chapter on good and evil, I explained this well, as best of my ability. And I could tell you, I remember when the book came out, I got quite a few interesting comments on it, because many people have never heard, like, where are the roots of evil? Where does it start? How is it possible that an omnipresent God and a good God, where is it even possible that it should begin? And it's possible because of the famous example of the Tzimtzum, the example the father hides from his child. The only reason is because he wants the child to bring out his deeper strengths through his effort to find the father. But the child stops looking because the concealment is so well done, the child stops looking. So the concealment was only, its purpose was revelation, but it was misunderstood. Once it's misunderstood and you begin to go off into your own agenda and you forget that the whole concealment is for you to reveal God, to reveal the Father, that's where the problem starts evolving. And if it continues, you can get a world that is a complete world of destruction, like what happened by the Mabul. Mola Oret Shachas, the whole world was filled with crime. Didn't begin that way. It began with one shift. It's like Friedrich Rebbe brings, I think, somewhere, no one gets lost in a forest in a second. You go off the beaten track a little, and you continue going, and at some point you're completely lost. Now, if you just retraced your steps that when you first wandered off, you could have found your way back easily. But if you keep going in that direction and you're convinced that maybe it's fine, then at some point you can't find your way back that easily. So in other words, nothing begins with a full-blown, everything begins with something smaller that just becomes magnified and amplified, like it is, and it's not nipped in the bud and addressed at the outset. So essentially, this is a very big topic that Rebbe speaks about very often, why the Mabul, for example, didn't come down right away, a flood. It came down drops because the Eibishter wanted to give them a chance to do tshuva. The same thing is with other situations. First, there's a warning, then there's a second warning, because the process is correct your ways. For example, the Babylonians surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Then they breached its wall. It didn't all happen in one day. And then 3 weeks later, they burned down the Beis Hamikdash. All this is because, as the Rebbe explains psychologically, problems are not in the moment. You always have a chance to correct and fix, but then things escalate if you don't, and then even more escalate. So basically, I just want to explain that's how the Seder Shtalshalos works, that the Hisalmus Ha'ir comes to a point now that once you have the Metzias of the Levush of in Biy'a, and it's concealed there even more, that to the point that the Levushim of Biy'a, that the garments of Biy'a now begin to be a mixture, not clearly two different paths, it's a mix, which means a confusion in a way. Taruv is Tevera. Now here he does not mean Ra, because remember, Biy'a is the world of Gan Eden Elyon, is the world of Malachim, of the highest level of Srafim. So we're not talking about Ra as we know it, an evil act or a criminal act. We're talking about Tevera, something that is purely godly, like he says in Tanya, purely Kedusha, which is bottled Telikus, and Sitra Achre, which is not. It ultimately is going to evolve much more, as we're going to learn in a few lines. But right now, Taruvis Tevara, it's already a mixture of what is completely godly and what is not completely godly. I'm going to stop in a moment for questions. Let me just read a few more lines. Like he writes in Eitz Chaim, the Biy'a mi'utera. So he says there when he explains, he says, Atzilus is kulei tev, completely good, which means completely gedusha, holiness, bittul, elokus. Even though it's diminished and concealed, but it's still elokus. I'll just give you the full expression. In Biy'a, it says rubei tev u'miyutera. It's mostly good, and miyute, a small amount, is ra, miyute. Yitzira mechza al mechza. Yitzira is half and half tev, half ra. Vasiya is the opposite, rube ra, with a little miyute tev. It's mostly evil and a bit good. But you see, I don't want to use the word evil for the reasons I explained. Bottom line, it's all a matter of how much godliness. So in Biy'a, Rube is tev, meaning Rube is aligned with godliness. But there's already miyute is already the beginnings of something that is not aligned. And Yitzira, it's like it's even more diminished. So you have like half and half. He doesn't mean necessarily half and half quantitative, like that, it's not about like a cup of milk, that's half milk and half water. So shouldn't be seen half as in quantity. It means conceptually. And in Ra and in Asiya, it's Rube Ra, which is going to lead to the next line, Ubefrad be'elam atachten. Now he's going all the way to the lowest world. And this is taken from chapters 6 and 7 in Tanya, especially 7. But both. Be'elam atachten, in Asiya itself, you could have Asiya Ruchnis, a spiritual Asiya. But elam atachten is now we're going down to our low world, the lowest world, the Elam Atachten, Shekol Hadvarim Shebe'elam. All the items, all the entities, all the what's another word for Dvarim? Involvements in this world, Mu'rovim Tevara, are mixed of Tev and Ra. U'kamoshon is barely ill, and he's also referring to us earlier. Sev Dibra Master Roshi Amatis Hagimel U'bekama Duchtin. So the end of the Maimer Roshi Amatis Hagimel, which is back in volume 1, page 562, and Bekama Duchtin, meaning in other discourses or other sections. Umaylimim umastirim ala eir v'achayis alaki. So now we're talking about a much more deeper concealment. They're concealing and covering very much so ma'oid on the divine and the divine energy and vitality. This is the state of darkness of this world, which is a double and a double and a double darkness. Going back to the words he used when he began the discussion on page 1307. Commission is bodily ill. Like we learned earlier, he's referring most likely to page 1307, where he began this discussion. Before we continue, I'm going to stop here if there's anybody who wants to ask any questions. But what he's done here, you've seen, he's gone from Atzilus to Biy'a, and in Biy'a itself, level by level, Biy'a, Yitzira, Asiya, Rube Tev, Mechza, half and half, Rube Ra, all the way to this world, where we call it the Cheshach Kafla Mechupel, such a profound darkness, essentially where godliness is not apparent at all. And even when it's there, it takes effort, and it's everything that we need to do, which he's going to talk about more, and we'll discuss obviously in more detail as we read on. But I don't want to go into parentheses in the next lines before give you a chance to absorb this, digest it, and if you have any questions. So the parentheses on line 2, I'm already on top of page 1313. We moved the next page. So he's going to say, what's kofel mechupel? So there are different interpretations of what that means. Chosher kofel is already a double darkness. Kofel mechupel means basically quadruple, because it's kofel and mechupel. So it's like a double. So he says, b'mokem acher, elsewhere, it says that the kofel mechupel, there's two statements, hein hadalit klippus, are the four klippus. Now, what are the four klippus? Shalosh klippus atmeis and klippus nega, most likely. Because that's what he says in Tanya. He says that first there's the three, in the end of chapter 6, he talks about the three impure shells, or the impure husks, which is the darkest dark, completely forbidden, all the different things he explains there. And then he says, and the klippa hadalid, what's the fourth, is klippas nega, all from the Merkava of Yecheskel, where he uses all these references. He talks about the different terms that he uses there to explain the three klippas and then the klippas nega, the nega. So most likely that's what he means. So kofel mechupel, as I said, is four, is quadruple, double. The thing that is unclear to me is 3 and 1 is not 2 and 2. Shalosh klippus atmeis is one category. Klippus nega is another. If you say kofel mechupel, you're essentially saying two are shalosh klippus atmeis, and then there's one of the shalosh klippus atmeis that goes together with klippus nega in the second mechupel. Just pointing it out. I'm not saying that's a question, because you could say in the shalosh klippus atmeis there are those that are harsher than others. So it could be the most lenient of the three impure. The shalosh klippus atmeis goes together with klippus nega, but I'm not sure. He doesn't spell it out here. I'd have to see where that b'mokem acher, since he's referring to another location, it'd be good to find where that is in Chassidus, and maybe there it's explained more in detail. Anyway, I just wanted to point it out. But this is a parenthesis, so let's continue this parenthesis. It's a very dense and brief parenthesis, and he says that these two sets of klippas, kofel mechupel, the dalet klippas, hulu umazeh, the beis hayechudim, the avaya lekim, v'avaya eya. Okay, so in klippa, everything is zelo umazeh asa lekim. God creates everything as in like dual, parallel worlds. So what is the two levels in klippa and chosher kofel mechupel? Says the two levels correspond in kedusha to two levels of yechudim, which we learned earlier. You may recall we learned about the three levels: biti, achesi, imi, and I'll refer you what page that is. That goes back all the way. Here we are on page 1249. So if you look there, he talked about three levels of yichud. Havaya Adnai, which was Ibur, Havaya Lekim, and Havaya Eya. So is Ibur Yenika Moichin, like Mutfa Murgish Muskel, and he explained it with the Medrash, where God first says that you are like my daughter, and then he loves them even more. You're like my sister, you're like my mother. So all these three levels, they explained at length there on page 1249 and on. So he's saying that two of them, the two higher levels, not Biti, Malchus, Achesi, where Malchus elevates and is on the same level of Zah, like a sister, and Imi, Bina, it's Mashpia into Zah. He says those two Yechudim that we learned earlier are the Kedusha side, that with that corresponds the Kofel Mechupla of the Dal Klippas. Now, he doesn't explain at all why and what's the connection between the two. So I'd have to go back. If I recall correctly, the difference in Achesi and Imi is Achesi is where Eden learn Torah and they are able to be, they paskin in Torah. Like he spoke about the Sareh HaMalucha, the ministers. Biti is a makabel. It receives and follows the laws of Torah. But what about those that are called ministers? They learn Torah and they're paskin halachas, like the Tanoim and Amirayim. So he called them Achesi. Biti, I'm sorry, Imi, he said, was the neshamas that are higher than Teda and they're mashpia into Teda. So I'm trying to figure out why he's corresponding that to the other side of the coin, to the two levels of the klippas. I don't have it figured out, to be honest. I need to go back and learn that, or any of you can do that. Maybe there's something there, because he spoke about the biti, I'm sorry, Chesi and Imi relatively at length. So there may be something else that he said there that can give us a hint to why he's bringing this correspondence. I mean, why would he say that? But generally speaking, let's suffice it to say that the klippas is in the world of darkness, one state of darkness, and then even a higher state of a deeper state of darkness. In Gedusha, you also have holiness, Oyer, and even a deeper level of Oyer. So he's corresponding these two to these two. Again, needs explanation why, but he clearly says, imi, the page I mentioned before, 1249. Now, the B'mokem Acher, my guess is that it's not the Rebbe Rashab himself. It's either the Mittler Rebbe or the Tzemach Tzedek is what I would guess. Because he's talking about what is said in that Maimer, and he says, Umeir, Me'in, Vayovek, Avik Umavik. So there's the Posuk in Vayishlach, where it says where Yaakov wrestled with the angel. So it says Vayovek, he wrestled with him. So the question, of course, is asked, what exactly is this word Vayovek? What does it mean? So one of the meanings in it, Avik or Mavik, I have to look up what that means. I'm not sure. But he clearly explains, discusses and analyzes what does that word mean. And I have to look up what Avik or Mavik, but I do know that it says in Rashi and Medrash that Vayovik also comes from the word Avik, dust. Because when they wrestled on the ground, it caused dust to, it's like when people wrestle on earth, it caused the dust to rise. The dust represents a certain klippa that came out of the battle between Tov and Ra, Yaakov and Esav's angel. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying, Efsher HaKavoneh, possibly the intention is al Mashu Kosev al Maimer HaZeyar, to what it says on the Maimer HaZeyar, Be'inyan Zeh Shal Melchama Hyoye Bebezei Fanim, that the war, the battle between the Kedusha and the opposite was in two ways. V'hu inyan avok v'ofar, dust and earth. So avok is called dust, ofar is called earth, and it talks in that maimer, if I recall correctly, that there's two things that happen when you're fighting a war that results. One is dust and one is earth. I think one is obviously worse than the other, but again, I'd like to look into it before I comment. But here comes the next line that the Rebbe Rashab says himself. V'tzarich la'ayin, and we need to delve into this and look deeper into it. And I did not yet delve into it. That's what he says here. He's writing that to us. Now remember, this is volume 3, where the Rebbe Rashab did not have time to go back on and review it and edit and add, and definitely not Maimorim, definitely not chapters and summaries as he did earlier in the Hemshech. So it's very likely this he left for himself. And had he gone back, he would have maybe added to it. I'm just speculating, obviously, but he definitely left these words, and that's why it's printed, that he did not look into it himself. So I'm not saying I can look into it better than the Rebbe Rashab can, obviously not, but I still want to see what it says in the sources to just see what the Rebbe Rashab is hinting to here. Because he's clearly trying to analyze what kaflu mechupel is in the context of the darkness. And he's definitely equating it to the battle between Yaakov and Esav, or Yaakov's and Esav's angel, and the two levels of Avik ve'Ofar. And so I'm gonna look up. I'm trying to find where the sources are for this. I did not look it up yet, to be honest. If you guys want to look it up and find it, that would be great. Could all do this homework and compare notes. And I also want to look at the Maimer HaZeyar. This is probably Biy'a HaZeyar. about the battle and the two levels of the war, the two manners that this battle is fought. But regardless, it definitely is coming to explain cheshach kaful u'mechupel, the double here, the four different klippas. And maybe when you look into all of it, we'll figure out why does it correspond to the two yechudim of Avaya and Eya, Avaya Lekim and Avaya Eya. But so this is a parenthesis, and I do want to definitely look into it more, and I will do that. But please, at this point, I can't really say more because I'm not sure what it says in all the sources here. So let me stop again. If anybody wants to comment or say anything. So now he goes back to the cheshach kaful mechupel of this world. Remember, we moved from Atzilus to Biy'a, Yetzir, Asiya. We're in Asiya, Rubei Ra. And in this world, he said, it's cheshach de'elam hazeh, cheshach kaful mechupel. But now he's going to speak more about this world. U'lechein. And for that reason, vilechein, right? Vilechein. And for that reason, kol maise, elam hazeh, koshim. All the activities and all the what's the word I want to use? Kol maise. All the happenings in this world are koshim, are difficult. Like he says in Tanya, first section, Sefer Shalbeinim, part 1, end of chapter 6, where he says, "Kol el ma'asim koshim v'rashoim gevrim bei," and the wicked are dominant there. So it's not just a world where there's good and evil; the evil dominates, and all ma'asim and this world is a difficult world. Kol ma'asim are difficult, hostile, harsh. Koshim is also harsh. It's a harsh world. So that's how far we've gotten now, that the psalmist is to that extent. Because once you speak about koshim and all of that, you're talking about things that the godliness is not apparent. And actually, he elaborated on this back on page 1307, how dark it gets. That even though there's godliness in everything, but the world becomes completely controlled by the material world. He says, Gashmis v'chumis se'elam is the only thing that's discernible and recognized and apparent, and a lakus eina nira v'nigla klal. So he elaborated more there. Close the Tanya. Okay. So now we got into this level of concealment. And of course, all this is leading, and this is the purpose of existence, tachlis biy'a adam lamata, the purpose of why we're put in this world, is to reverse this process and illuminate not just the levels of Hasalmus and the higher levels, but start with this world, illuminating it with godliness through bringing out our divine soul, contemplation, and the emotions that he spoke about. Page 1308 and on. But before he does that, he's going to now say, this he's talked about the darkness and concealment in general of the world. He says, V'chein, so too, this is on a personal level. When the divine soul manifests and it gets enclosed into the animal soul, the levatcha zeis shakechas the nefesh alikiz boyim ba'akshama canal. Besides the fact, like we said earlier, that the faculties of the divine soul become more palpable and tangible and concrete and materialized. In addition to that, besides that, when there's a lack of aveda, a lack of serving God, so there's the initial concealment of the divine soul, but it can get worse than that. That when there's no aveda, the darkness of the animal soul becomes intensified. And even further darkens. So in addition to just the mere fact that the divine soul came down to this world, into the body and the animal soul, that already is a concealment, but it can get worse. If there's no Aveda, the dominance of the animal soul darkens the oir of the nefesh alikis, umatish keiche, and it weakens its energy. it actually weakens the divine soul. And this he said earlier as well. Just for the record, he said that on page 1308, he said clearly, he said at the beginning of the paragraph on page 1308. And he brings up proof to this from a pasuk, Moshe Kosav, Koshel be'eni keichi. Now, koshel comes from the word hakshol. It comes from the word like it. When you machshel someone, when you mislead someone, and you like, what's the word I want to use? The instigate, not instigate, incite or mislead. Koshel be'eni keichi. So through the affliction, misled and misdirected and distorted my strength. So he's explaining how the animal soul, when left untamed and undisciplined, it actually will darken and weaken the divine soul. Ivus va'ikum. Ivus va'ikum is like what I said earlier. Ivus va'ikum is when you the crookedness. When you're going in a crooked way, you're not going on a path, someone misleads you. So ivus v'ikum is when you're being misled. It's two different terms for crookedness. Nechlash koyach hanefesh, the power of the soul gets weakened. She'ein biyacholte lotzeis min narteke. It doesn't have the strength, it doesn't have the power and the capacity to go out of its nartik. Nartik is its sheath, meaning it's like trapped in its, like being held hostage, trapped in its membrane. Nartik, sometimes nartik, as we talk about the sun has a sheath around the sun. Here, nartik is almost like its prison. But nartik means from its the thing that is containing it or confining it. The hislapshus b'bchinas golus. And this is the hislapshus, the manifestation of the divine soul in a state of golus. This is called golus haneshama. That's now displaced and not basically in prison. It's not in its natural habitat, divine place. U'kamoshn is barely ill. She has beis mine hislapshus. Like it was discussed earlier, explained earlier, that there are two types of hislapshus, of manifestation. I don't remember where. Maybe you could find it. I do remember vaguely that one is hislapshus, where it's just like the faculties are mislabish in the body's limbs and organs, but that doesn't mean it's golus. And then there's a deeper hislapshus where it actually is in golus. What he's saying here, in addition to the concealment, the natural concealment of it simply coming into a body, an animal soul, there's an additional that literally puts it in prison, that the divine soul is now in a state of golus, in a state of displacement. So he definitely spoke about these two types of hislapshus. I remember it was on the left side of the page, but I don't remember what page it was. I don't want to start looking now because I don't recall how far back it was. But I definitely remember the two levels of hislapshus. Okay, we'll find it. So I'm going to stop here because now the vizayis, the next lines are going to go back now. And this is now the avoid of the person to reverse this whole thing. So basically the Rebbe Rashab in the last few pages has given us the evolution of concealment and darkness to the point of golus mamish. So it started out with just concealment of the Eira Bligvul, then the Eira Gvul, then Biy'a, Yetzira, Asiyah, all the way to this world. All the way in this world itself, we have states that are not golus, to the state of real golus, of real displacement. And now we're going to talk about what's the avoid of the person that to radiate, illuminate, and ultimately transform this darkness. He's going to come back now to that, the bezois. But this is where I'm going to stop by beis mine hislapshus. Any questions, my friends?
So first, I found the first reference to beis mine hislapshus. Aleph. This is a chelik.
What Aleph. Page? Chelik Aleph? Volume 1?
Chelik Aleph. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1.
Volume
Well,
one?
Yeah, it doesn't find itself in volume 2. Kuf Mem, it says, Kiyadu, Beis Minei Hislapshus Ha'alaf HaMelubash Moshel V'kmo B'islapshus HaNefesh B'guf V'Habeis She'Hamalbish Moshel Kmo Be'inyan HaGilgulim Rahman Alatzmam Shebehema Mosheches Es HaNefesh Ha'adam B'chol HaChomriya
Okay,
Shela Ve'eno.
it sounds similar to what he's referring to here, but I think there's something in volume 3 where he also referred to it. Okay, fine. Page Kuf Mem, you said 140?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Thank you.
didn't see it in volume 3.
Okay.
Other than here.
Maybe you have to look at a different word, not Beis Minei Slapshus, maybe Golos or something. Okay, fine. So it's but thank you. That's good.
Yeah.
Commotion is barley hill, I would think would mean earlier than back in volume 1, but it's possible. It's possible he means that because it's these, or maybe he mentioned it again later. Fine, but I got it.
I have a question. He kind of snuck in Choshech in here just in passing, which I wish you would have gone in more to detail.
Why snuck in? He started the whole topic with Choshech on page 1307.
Yeah,
That's
I know, but okay. I was being a little bit whatever. I don't. Let me ask my question. Hine beheder havodash nasa hatikboris achoshech. The nefesh behema. So what I mean by snuck in is he never really explained the choshech of the nefesh behema in terms of whether it's the absence of light or bria bifnei atzmo.
Because he hasn't finished the topic yet. I mean, the Rebbe Rashab knows how he began about the absence of light or the substance. As I said, just be patient.
Okay. I'm still still trying to understand like what gives rise to this choshech as a separate creation. The absence of light, one can understand. We're spending a lot of time on
God created choshech. He created a thing called a state of darkness.
I get that. Of course, I accept that on its face. But in terms of
listen, you're processing and I'm trying to absorb. So I can't process right now because unless you want to go peek ahead, which you can freely do, and you'll see what he says. I mean, I'm patient. I'll when it comes, it comes.
Okay, it's fine. I do this. I know I do this a lot. I'll be patient. Yeah, it's fine.
No, I mean, what can I say? The Rebbe Rashab didn't get back to it yet.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the question would be which form of choshech do you understand this to be? And I guess you'd say
I don't even process like that because since I know the Rebbe Rashab is leading this charge here, I trust him. Now, if we'll see what he says. If there's questions after that,
we'll try and figure it out.
That's my approach to how to teach and learn this.
Okay, my dear teacher.
And we have to see where he's going to get back to it even. I'm not even sure where he gets back to it. I could speculate and try to speculate, but I'd rather see it inside and then we'll try to understand it.
Okay.
Okay, so we're stopping here. Beis Minei Slapshus.